The square is probably the most common patch we work with in quilt making. If we're not using pre-cuts or scraps, we're most likely cutting fabric from yardage, and most every time we cut from yardage, we start by cutting strips, then subcutting those strips into the patches we need. In the first part of this video, I show you how to cut strips and how to subcut those strips into squares using several different tools. The basic 5.5 inch by 12.5 inch ruler, the Stripology ruler, and the AccuQuilt system. If you look in the description below this video, you'll see a table of contents of where these demos are in the video, so you can click on the ones that interest you and go right to that section in the video. In the second part, I show you 2 different quilts you can make with just squares. I'll show you how to use the quilting apps to answer the 2 most common questions I get. They are, how many blocks do I need? And how much fabric do I need to make each of those quilts in any size you desire? So let's get started. I layer the fabric 4 layers. Even up one side, flip it around, and then I cut 2 strips from 5 inches. I first make the 5-inch cut, then I make the 2.5 inch cut, and I have 2 of my strips. Next, I want to subcut these into 16 2.5 inch squares. So I'm moving the selvage away so I can cut the selvage off and the fold off at the same time. And then I want to check that I have 10 inches of usable space. So I'll just measure. I have more than 10 inches that I need. Now we're going to cut. I'm checking the fold underneath, and I'm cutting off the fold and the selvages. Next, I position my ruler at the 5-inch mark and cut. Then I move it down to the 2.5 inch mark and cut. Now I have 8 pieces cut. Now do the same thing, the 5-inch mark and cut, and the 2.5 inch mark and cut. Now I have my 16 2.5 inch squares. This is the Stripology ruler. It has slots at every 1/2 inch mark. It starts with 0 on this side and goes to 20 inches over here. And I put my fabric underneath it and I use it to cut strips. Here is some fabric. It's 9 inches times the width of fabric. So I have my 2 selvages together on this side and the fold is on this side. And then I fold it in half again. So I have 4 layers of fabric. And this is not trimmed off on the sides. Put the fabric down, then I put the Stripology ruler on top. Move this over some. And there are many lines going this way and this way that you can align the fabric. So I look at the fold and I put one of these lines on the fold. And you need to make sure you have these open areas clear for your rotary cutter. So I'm lining up one of the lines down here on the fold, and I'm making sure that the 0 slot is enough that I can trim off the edge of this, the uneven edge of this piece of fabric. 3 strips at 2.5 inches. So I need to make sure from 0 to 7.5 I have fabric, so I'll have about 1 inch left over. And then once you're ready, you just put the cutter in the slot and cut. So there's 1. I go to the 2.5 inch mark. That's 2 cuts. Then allow the 5 inch and the 7.5 inch. And when we take this away, we have our trimmed edge here. And this is our leftover, and I'm going to save that because that's enough to do something with. And then we have our 3 strips at 2.5 inches. I'm going to leave 2 at 2.5 inches for jelly roll strips. Put those off to the side. Now I'm going to take this piece, checking the selvage, so I'm going to move this over. If I turn this over here, you can see the selvage is here, and this is my fold. So when I cut this edge, I'll cut off the fold and the selvage. And then I need to make sure the rest of this, I have at least 10 inches. So if I measure this, I have 10 inches across, because with 2.5 inch strips, you can get 16 2.5 inch squares. Now I take my Stripology ruler again, place my 0 mark just past the fold, so I'll cut that off, and then line up one of the lines down at the bottom of the strip like this. So I'm going to start cutting my 2.5 inches. First I'll cut at the 0 to trim it up. Now I'll cut 2.5 inches, 5 inches, and 7.5 inches, and 10 inches. Take this off. I have this extra scrap. Here are 4 squares, another 4 sets of 4, so I have 16 2.5 inch squares. And I can add these to my 2.5 inch square container. Another thing you can do with your Stripology ruler is take your strips you've cut, and these are in half, so this is the fold and this is the selvage. Line up the selvages because you want to cut those off. So I have 3 lined up here. I think you can do 4 at 2.5 inches before you run out of space, but 3 works good. And you can also do this if you have strip sets cut and you want to subcut your strip sets. You can stack them. Now I'll put this ruler on here, and I want to cut off the selvage, so I make sure the 0 line is away from the selvage. And I'm lining up one of the lines at the bottom. And these are all lined up, butted against each other. Now I'll cut off the selvage at the 0, then make my cuts. 2.5, 5, 7.5, 10, 12.5, 15, 17.5, and 20. Now I'll pull off the sides. There's probably enough to get another 2.5 inches on this one. I'll have to check it and see. Then pull off these selvages. And here we have all of our 2.5 inch squares. There are 2 in each of these stacks. This is the 2.5 inch strip cutter from AccuQuilt. It's 10 inches wide by about 24 inches long. This 2.5 inch cutter will cut 3 strips at once, but we can also do up to 9 strips. There are 4 blades that cut the strips. There are 2 lines that are straight on this side and straight on this side that you can use to line up your fabric. These are angled lines where we can cut different shapes later, and we'll get to that when we get to those shapes. Here is my fabric. It's as it comes off the bolt. Here are the selvages and here are the fold. I put the fold along this line here. It's the one that's not marked. This one is marked 90 degrees. And I put it just below the line so I can see it. And then I want to check. The blades come out to right about here, and I can see about 1/4 inch of the blades showing. So you want to make sure that your fabric is not going past those blades, otherwise it won't cut. And I'm also making sure that I have enough distance from this blade to the fabric on this side. And the same thing here. Here's the blade. I want to make sure I have enough fabric over here. Now this was already pre-cut at 9 inches. Normally I would cut this at 8 inches. So I'll have a little waste. You want to make sure that there are no creases in here and everything lays nice and flat. So I'm going to put 3 layers of these pieces. I can cut 9 strips at once at the same time. I'm lining them up evenly. I'm slightly moving it down so the folds are not stacked directly on top of each other, and I still have enough space over here with my blades showing. Let's put one more, because with the strip cutters you can cut up to 6 layers at once. Now this will move up a little bit. Now I'll put my mat on top of this and run it through my machine. Run it through the machine, and AccuQuilt tells you to rub this to get the static off. So I've done that. All right, I got a new camera and it went dead on me as I was going through this. So I didn't get to show you how I take the mat off. You rub the mat and then you slide the mat off. And I took off these edges here and here. So this was the waist on the sides. Then when you do that, you have 3 layers of strips there, 3 here, and 3 here for a total of 9 strips. That's the maximum you can cut on this. So now I want to show you how you can subcut these. I'll take one strip first, and I start with the selvage edge, and I place it on this blade, just past that blade, and I'm lining up the edge with this mark here, because I want this blade to cut that selvage off. Now I'll fold this back this way, and I make sure that I have enough here that the blades will cut where they're supposed to, so there's a little bit extra on outside the blade, and it's lined up with the other layer. Then move it back here, fold it again, and make sure I have enough covering this blade and covering the second blade. So it's blade, the first space, the second space, and then this fold is just past that blade. So I'll have 6 layers here, 6 layers here, and 4 layers here. So that's a total of 16. And now I take my next strip and I do the same thing. This time I'm going to butt the strips up next to each other and make sure they're nice and even. So I have my selvage off the way, and then fold this and fold it back this way. Now this one's not as long. Now we have it. So this clears the blade here and clears the blade here. And let's do one more. So let's do one more. Place it like that. These got all out of whack with my camera messing up. Okay, so I'll place it like this. This is called fan folding. And then fold this way. Okay, and you could do probably another 3 more down this way. Now I'll put my mat on top of this and make my second cut. Now you rub the mat to get the static off, and what I wanted to show you before is I hold the opposite sides and I leave my thumb down at the bottom. So my fingers are lifting up the edges while my thumbs are keeping it flat as I can on this die. So then I slide it off. And that takes off all the static. So we pull off this excess here and the excess here. And now we have our 2.5 inch strips. So there's 6, there's 12, and 4 more makes 16. Now these little pieces come off because this is the excess that was folded over this blade. Now we have 3 sets of 16 2.5 inch squares. In the rest of this video, I'm going to be showing you different quilts and show you how you can use the quilting apps to calculate how many blocks you need per quilt and how much fabric you need for the whole quilt. They're all made with squares. This is a code you can scan or click if you're online, and it'll take you directly to my blog page with these 2 apps. And there will also be a link in the description below this video. That's also where you can find these instructions that we're going over right now. For these, we're going to use the quilting apps on my blog, and there are 2 of the quilting apps. On this page, you're going to see a lot of ads. Don't click on any of those ads. Anything you can click on will be inside the body of the blog. So all of this stuff is just ads, blah, blah, blah. Get them out of the way. And I just enlarge it like this, and they go away. So the quilt calculators, I'm calling them the quilting apps. The first one is called Sizing a Quilt. All you need to know for this right now is the width and the height of the block, and this is all the finished sizes. And you also need to know about how big you want the quilt, and you need to know that in inches. You can't say, I want a queen size quilt. You need to come up with a width measurement and a length measurement of the finished quilt you want. This is an example of a conversation I've had many, many times over the years with so many quilt makers. How many blocks do I need for a queen size quilt? It's always a queen size or a king size. It's never a smaller quilt, it seems. Okay, so here's what I say. All right, a queen size mattress is about 60 by 80. I can't remember if that's what it really is, but in our example, it's going to be 60 by 80. Do you want a 60 by 80 quilt? Because this quilt will only cover the top of the mattress, the queen size mattress. Oh no, I want it to go down the sides. Okay, how thick is your mattress? Do you want it to cover the entire mattress? Yeah, I want it to cover the entire mattress, and it's probably about 10 inches thick. Okay, so we need to add 10 inches to each side. So we add a 10 over here and a 10 over here. Would you also like to add that 10 inches to the foot of the bed? Yes, I would like to add it to the foot of the bed. So now we started off with a 60 by 80 inch quilt. Now we have 60 plus 10 plus 10 is 80 by 80 plus 10 is 90. Let's put these in here so we won't get confused. So I won't get confused. Okay. So the width now is 60 plus 10 plus 10 is 80. And the length is now 80 plus 10, which is 90. Okay. Oh, and then the person says, I would like to have a little bit longer so it would cover the sideboards. Okay, how much longer do you want it? Oh, I don't know. How big is the sideboard? Well, it's whatever your sideboard is. So we end up with, okay, let's add another 5 inches to each side. So we have 5 here and 5 here. And do you want to add it to the bottom? No, I'll just leave the bottom as it is because the footboard will cover that. So now our 90 inches is the same, the 80 plus 10, but now we have 80 inches plus another 10 inches. Now we have a 90 by 90 inch quilt. That's quite a big difference than a 60 by 80 inch quilt. So these are the measurements you will use when you're calculating the size of a quilt. This is the finished size. And a lot of times I like to recommend that people add 2 or 3 inches extra for shrinkage. The batting may shrink. If you put a lot of quilting on it, that's going to shrink it up. So you want to make sure that right off the bat, after it's been quilted and it shrinks up 3 inches, then it's already too short. So you might want to add a few inches, and that's up to you, completely up to you. So that makes this a 93 by 93. And we'll use the 93 by 93 in our calculations today. This number can be anything you want it to be. For the second app, we just scroll down to this, how much fabric do I need? And we're going to calculate the fabric we need by using patches. And if you followed my block of the day all last year in 2023, you'll see we had patches almost every day. This is just a little bit of information in case you forget. It just tells you how to use the app. And here's an example of your lengthwise and crosswise grain. And we talked about those in Chapter 1, the very first workshop. And this just is an example up here. The only things we put in for this app are the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain measurement of the patch. And with this, we're using patches that we're cutting. So we use the cut size in this application. So we'll need the size of the patch, and we'll need to know how many patches are in the quilt. Then once we put those three numbers in, it'll give us the cutting instructions and the fabric requirements for that patch. It's just two simple apps, but it's just understanding how they work and what you need to put in. Once you understand that, the sky's the limit. You can pretty much calculate fabric and quilt size for just about anything you want to do. So now let's get started on the first quilt. We're going to start with the first quilt, which is a one-patch quilt. And for this example, our patch is going to be a square. The patch will be 6.5 inches cut and 6 inches finished. So remember, we need the finished size when we size the quilt and the cut size when we try to figure out how much fabric we need. So first we'll write the block size down. And in this case, since it's a one-patch quilt, the block and the patch can be the same thing. So the block is the patch. So our block size, 6 inches wide by 6 inches tall. That's the finished size. Now we want to figure out how many blocks we need to set across and how many blocks we need to set down to get the 93 by 93 inch quilt. So we go to our AccuQuilt app, and we're going to put the block width as 6 inches and the height as 6 inches. We need to just kind of guess or put some estimates in there of how many blocks go across to get our 93 inches. So I'm going to put 15 blocks across. And this is a square quilt, 93 by 93, so I'll put 15 in this side too. We're going to see what 15 blocks across and 15 blocks down gives us, what size quilt. In this app, we have to click this calculate button each time. So now we have a quilt width of 90 inches and a length of 90 inches. That's really close. Now you have to decide, you want a 93 inch quilt, and I always err on the larger size. So I would add another block to the across and the down. We'll have 16 across and 16 down. And then we press the calculate button again, and we get 96 by 96. So I'm happy with that. On this page, we're going to write blocks across, and we'll get it off of our app. It says 16 blocks across and 16 blocks down. The quilt width will be 96 inches by 96 inches. And the number of blocks. So down here it says the total number of blocks is 256. So we'll write that in this space here. And I've highlighted the number of blocks because we're going to use that in the next calculation for the fabric. And while you're here, you'll see that this gives you also the number of 2.5 inch binding strips you need and the yardage for the binding. So I'll go ahead and write that down. We need 10 strips at 2.5 inches. Yardage is 0.69. So I'm going to round that up to 3/4, which is 0.75 is 3/4 of a yard. That won't change as long as your quilt is the same size. Now let's look at how much fabric we need, and we're going to use the cut size for this. So patch A, we have one patch per block because in this example the patch is the block. And so you multiply the 1 times the number of blocks. So 1 times 256 is 256. We have 256 blocks or patches. In this case, remember, they're interchanged. And now we're going to put in the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain. We're going to cut 6.5 inch squares. So the lengthwise grain will be 6.5 inches. And the crosswise will be 6.5 inches. And the number of patches we need is 256. 256. Now with this part of the app, as soon as you put in all three numbers, the calculations are made. You don't have to press a calculate button. And here it gives you the answers. Cut 43 strips at 6.5 inches times the width of fabric. Subcut each strip into 6 segments of 6.5 inches. So this tells you each strip will give you 6 squares at 6.5 inches. This is a total of 256 pieces, and this is the fabric you need, which is 280 inches or approximately 7.78 yards. So I would round that up to 8 yards, because remember, this amount you need here is the exact amount. It doesn't take into account any errors in cutting. It doesn't take into account wonky fabric or shrinkage. So always add to this, because this is exactly the amount you need. Now we'll look over here and we'll just transfer all these numbers to our sheet. So the lengthwise grain we put in was 6.5 and the crosswise was 6.5. And it says cut 43 strips at 6.5 inches times the width of fabric. Cut each strip into 6 segments at 6.5 inches for a total of 256. And so we need 280 inches. And the reason I put the inches on here is because if you had a fabric that was used as patch A and later again as patch E, you would want to add up the inches and then convert that to yards. But we will get to that some other workshop. And I'm just going to round this up to 8 yards. So now we're done with this. So let's look at this. What do we have and what can we do with this information? You know you don't want to cut 43 strips of the same fabric. So what you could do here is, if we rounded this up to 44 strips, just to make our math easier, if you were going to make this checkerboard quilt, you would take your 44 strips and divide it in 2, because one is the red fabric and one is the white fabric. So if you had 44 strips, you would need 22 strips of the red and 22 strips of the white. So that's how you can tell your yardage. This is the total yardage you need for a quilt that's 96 inches square. And if you wanted to just cut squares from scraps, you can just cut your squares and keep track of them. And when you have 256, you'll know you'll have enough. And then this tells you up here that the blocks across is 16 blocks across and 16 blocks down. So that's an easy way to do a one-patch quilt. And also, if you wanted to cut a scrappy quilt from strips, you could get 43 different strips, or you can get 43 different strips or 22 different strips and cut 2 strips of each. This just gives you a number to aim for. So you'll have an approximate amount of how much fabric you need to make this quilt. The next quilt we're going to do is from Block of the Day, and it's 1212 Hard Candy Block, and it was December 12th that this was released. We have 2 patches in this block, and it finishes at 8 inches. Patch A is a 4.5 inch square, and patch B is a 2.5 inch square. And here is the diagram. This will look familiar to you if you were doing Blocks of the Day last year in 2023. And for this example, I'm going to say I want a quilt size about 60 by 80. That's usually my go-to quilt size. I always start with that. So we're going to use that and do the same calculations we did for the other quilt. We'll size the quilt first, and for how much fabric we need, we'll have to do our calculations for each patch separately. We'll do patch A, then patch B. Now you'll have to refresh your screen if you had data in there, so that will clear out the data from the previous quilt. So now let's look at the block. This is an 8-inch block, so we're going to put 8 inches in the height and the width, and 8 inches in the height, we want a 60 by 80 inch quilt. So I'm just going to guess. I'm going to put 5 across, and let's do 7 down. Then we press the calculate button, and I only have a 40 by 56 inch quilt, so I'm way off. Let's put 8 in here, and let's do 10 in the length. Come back down here and press the calculate button. Now that gives us 64 by 80. I'm going to leave it at 64 by 80. That's my new finished quilt size. So I'll write that over here. I'll put quilt width is 64 by 80, and my blocks across are 8, and my blocks down are 10. Okay, and let's see, the number of blocks is 80. It's right down here. We'll put that in here. And here's my binding, so I'll go ahead and put that information here. 8 strips, and it looks like 0.56 yards. So I'm going to leave that now, and I can just decide on that later how much I'm going to buy. But it's going to be over a half a yard. Now let's scroll down to our how much fabric do I need. We'll look at our patches. So patch A, we have 2 patch A's per block, and so you can look up in the diagram here. You'll see that the A patches are these big patches, so there are 2. And we take patch A is 2 per block times the number of blocks. We have 80 blocks, so 2 times 80 is 160. So I'll need 160 patch A's. Then let's go ahead and calculate that. The lengthwise grain of patch A is 4.5. And the crosswise grain is the same, 4.5. And we need 160 patches. So we'll put the number needed is 160. And we'll look here at our results. So we need to cut 18 strips at 4.5 inches times the width of fabric. Subcut each strip into 9 segments at 4.5 inches. For a total of 160 pieces. Oops, I wrote that in the wrong spot. So the fabric needed is 81 inches, or approximately 2.25 yards. So this is for patch A. Remember, this is if we're making patch A out of the same fabric, so we'll look at that later. Patch B are these small little 4 patch units, and we have 4 up here and 4 down here, so a total of 8. So for patch B, we have 8 per block, and we have 80 blocks. So we need to multiply 8 patches times 80 blocks. You can just go your calculator on your phone. 8 times 80 is 640. So we'll write that, 640 patch B's. And our lengthwise grain is going to be 2.5, and crosswise is 2.5. And we can just put the numbers, overwrite these numbers. Lengthwise grain is 2.5. Crosswise grain, 2.5, 2.5. And the number of patches we need is 640. Here are the results. We'll need 40 strips at 2.5 inches times the width of fabric, and you cut each strip into 16 segments at 2.5 inches. For a total of 640 pieces, we need 100 inches or 2.78 yards. 2.78 yards. Now we're done with this. Let's see what we have here. For patch A, our results are we need 18 strips at 4.5 inches times the width of fabric. If you want to make scrappy quilt where you have a light and a dark, I would just cut that in half, and you need 9 strips of light fabrics and 9 strips of dark fabrics, and that would get you what you need. So you can mix up all your fabrics. You can have 9 different lights and 9 different darks. But just make sure you have a total of 18 strips for patch A, which is the large patch. Now patch B, this gives you something interesting because we have a 4 patch. Patch B makes a 4 patch. If you need 40 strips at 2.5 inches, that's like a jelly roll. But if you want to do your lights and your darks, like in this picture, you could simply take 20 light strips and 20 dark strips, and you can sew those together and do strip piecing. You don't even have to subcut these into segments if you didn't want to. You could just make 20 strip sets, light and dark each, and subcut those into 2.5 inch segments and sew those together, and you have your 4 patch units. Or if you had a whole big stack or a big container of light and dark 2.5 inch squares, just count out 640. You can get 320 lights and 320 darks and sew those all together into 4 patches. If you can, just play around with it a little bit with your numbers and see how you like it. Once you understand how to use the apps and you know that there's only a few pieces of data that need to go in there, and don't be afraid to use your calculator. It's simply multiplication and division. Next week we'll be doing rectangles. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.